Hi, and welcome to another episode of Rule of Carnage, where myself, Glenn Ford, a games designer and developer, chats to this guy, Mike Hutchinson, who is also a games developer and designer. And we talk about designing better miniatures games, all the bits and pieces of designing better miniatures games, the mechanics, the models. And today we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about the story, the world building that goes on around maybe the nuts and bolts of designing a game. Partly because Mike, you're right in the thick of a little bit of world building of your own with Hobgoblin. Now, obviously, you've created a vibrant post-apocalyptic world with Gaslands. You've created a distant sort of high sci-fi world with a billion suns, and now you're working through the process of creating a whole fantasy world universe
Mm-hmm.
with Hobgoblin. Obviously, a lot of people do their world building, their fluff creation, their micro narratives and bits and pieces, and it's something that people can spend quite a lot of time working on. So we're going to try and have a chat about where it clicks into the crunchier bits of designing, how much of it you want, the things that are tricky about it, and where exactly Mike is in his current sort of process doing it. So maybe we can open up having a little chat about where you are with Hobgoblin and what you're sort of working through at the moment with that world building. So Hobgoblin's a fantasy underground world, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to preface this conversation by saying I am not an expert in world building. And the more I get into it, the more I realize what phenomenal amount of resources and thought other people have put into this. I suppose probably more from like fiction writing, but also I guess increasingly video game design as well. But I find this part of the process as fascinating as all the other parts. I'm just less practiced at it because for whatever reason, I find myself in idle moments inventing new games and new game systems. Whereas I'm sure there are imaginative people who are using their imaginations to continually invent new worlds and new kind of fantasy environments or and
Yeah,
those people are probably like me, role-playing GMs, and are maybe coming up with a cool idea for a new role-playing campaign or a new role-playing setting that they might want to play in. And I
yeah,
suppose that as a first point is, I suppose, how to some degree I approach the general problem of world building, which is that and my chum Sean Sutter has said this to me several times. He sort of says, as a game designer, I sort of see us as GMs, where like we have to create the sort of playground in which people are going to play their games and in which their imaginations are going to run riot. So yeah.
yeah. I think I mean I don't want to generalize, but I think there is a certain
Go
number
on.
of thwarted novelists sort of dotted around in the game writing world, and you do sometimes come across a game and you go, I don't want to go through this level of world building in order to get to the crunchy meat of the game. I mean, personally,
Maybe I guess one thing that strikes me is that war games, particularly where there's a DIY element to it, benefit from a little deeper fluff than perhaps a pull out of the box board game.
I think it's yeah, I think that's an interesting one, and I think that there is. Okay, so in my opinion, there's a difference between the level of world building that I want from a character-driven skirmish game like Malifaux
Hmm.
versus the level of world building I really want in a game that's maybe a little bit looser into what I'm creating, like say Warhammer. And so in a game of Warhammer, I'll often have a hero, a general, a leader, a mage, or whatever, who isn't a character who's established in the world, and I might have an army that I want to be doing something a little bit weird with. I've got a goblin's army which are all forest goblins, and they're led by this Romeo and Juliet goblin who fell in love with an elf, and him and the elf are eloping, and they've got to fight their way, through other elves. And I created a whole world for them, and a whole situation. And I want the Warhammer world to be quite loose and vague in parts, because I want to go off and do something weird. I want my frost ogres, to be a possibility in that world. Whereas in something like Malifaux, all of my guys have got names, and they've got backgrounds, and they've got relationship with the other guys that are on the tabletop, and they feel a certain way about that person, and I don't have too much sort of input on that. I don't know whether it's a personal thing, because I tend not to convert Malifaux models. I get them out of the box, I paint them up, I put them on the table. I tend to rip apart a whole Warhammer army and green stuff and build and create it. And also, when I'm writing a Warhammer army that's that much more in depth, I want to create a story for it. So I know personally, I think that there is a continuum here, and there can be such a thing as too much world building, depending on what's driving your game and how you're sort of catching people's hobby imagination, and all sorts of things like that. I mean, as a lot of these things.
It's interesting. It's interesting, because I suppose, like, I sort of came from the rich worlds of Warhammer and so forth in my gaming heritage, and that's had like 30 plus years of development leading into it. And then sort of my first experience was the very setting light Osprey Blue books. So two games in that setting, both two games in that format, where the setting material was deliberately restricted to being a very small number of words, to partly to fit the very sort of inexpensive format, but I think also partly to provide a lot of space for miniature agnostic games to sort of give the keys to the kingdom over to the player and be like, well, the purpose of these kinds of games is to let your imagination run free, not for me to define over hundreds of pages all of the specific towns and cities and which roads lead to where and how many goblins there are on each road and so forth. But I also think that they're also self-contained games, and so there is, I think, more necessity for richer world building in a game that is intended to last for longer or have a series of products expanded into it. So I think that with Gaslands as it was originally written, like, it just needed to point at a genre, evoke that genre very crisply in the reader's mind, and then reinforce and hammer that genre in on the table with all the rules. But like, I love the fact that I managed to catch people's attention really early on, and people quite often introduce the setting by saying, oh yeah, so Gaslands, it's like a post-apocalyptic future where the space race carried on, and instead of the space race finishing in the 60s, it carried on and we landed on Mars, and then Mars seceded, and then there was a war. And like, just that one moment where I created a timeline at the beginning of the book, which I'm pretty sure, I can't remember where I stole that from. It's probably from Warhammer Army books, which always have those like ridiculously overblown timelines. But it started with that little timeline, and that first divergence sort of seems to be enough to catch people's attention, and then their imagination starts spinning out, and they can sort of be like, oh, okay, it's a sort of 70s space race thing that leads me into 80s action movies. I can see Arnold Schwarzenegger already in this movie. Like, I can kind of, and so I think that was like one of, I think, the flavors of world building that I'm actually very, very strenuously trying to avoid in Hobgoblin, but worked really nicely in A Billion Suns, was like finding the little tiny genre chord to play on your little tiny piano and just be like, pring, it's like that. And everyone goes, oh yes, I know exactly what you mean. And then just smattering enough sort of seasoning across the book, particularly with A Billion Suns, which also has, I think, to a degree, a sort of, it's like, it's space, but something, and the but something is corporations are arguing over space. And then throughout the book, I kind of found ways to reinforce that theme in the captions of the photos and in the names of the special rules and so forth. But with Hobgoblin, I'm trying a bit more of a, and it's odd because probably, I don't really know exactly, but probably Hobgoblin will be a single rule book like these other two games, and it will be in and of itself a lovely object. But that because the game is tapping into the great richness of fantasy army miniatures that exist, not just in Warhammer and Mantic and stuff, but now like the insanely amazing ranges that come out of all of these 3D print sort of intended designers. Like I'm working with a few of them, like Lost Kingdom and One Page Rules and Highland Miniatures and stuff. And like these armies look amazing. And so because I'm sort of playing into all that richness, and there has to be reasons and explanations for all these really colorful, unique creatures and goodies and baddies to be interacting, like I feel like maybe it's partly the expectation. I feel like people expect a fantasy worlds to be a bit more rich and fleshed out than perhaps a science fiction. Science fiction novels can be very ideas based, and as long as the idea is amazing, it sort of doesn't matter what the rest of the furniture is. Whereas it seems less true in fantasy. Like fantasy has to be a bit sort of squidgier and realer and or more lived in, not lived in, more like realized.
I'm curious about this to a degree, because it's like the thing with Gaslands is that Gaslands is sort of post-apocalyptic.
I can't say post-apocalyptic.
Post-apocalyptic vehicular, combats. That's Mad Max and that's Death Race, and that's pretty much your whole genre, more or less, right there. And so once you say that, it's like, well, okay, it's them, it's somewhere in between the two of those, that's about where it is, and now it can be its own thing, because there's only three of them and it's in between these other two. But then you say, okay, it's fantasy, and then it's like, okay, so we've got Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, and such a massive genre that fantasy isn't anything like as high level sort of definitional as.
It doesn't tell you as much. It's not as information packed. Although I oddly do think that fantasy in general, like there's a few, I think it's a bit more homogenous than perhaps science fiction is, but maybe that's just because I'm better read in science fiction. That's probably just my bias.
Yeah, I think that I think that fantasy, I think, is certainly a much broader field than post-apocalyptic vehicular based.
Yeah.
I think that's possibly part of. I don't know. I don't know, because it is you're the one in the middle of sort of writing it. I think possibly that might be one of the drivers as to why you feel like Hobgoblin.
You have, right. I feel like I have to fight a bit harder to define what is particular and unique about it.
Yeah.
And I suppose I came up with a concept fairly early on, which is, all right, I'm going to set it underground, and then I'm going to try and find ways to solve the obvious problem, which is what an army game underground. I could understand a dungeon delving game or a role-playing game or those kinds of things being underground, but what, like a whole army? And then I thought, well, yeah, actually, because if we set it like in the entirety of the sort of 1,800 miles that there are between the surface of the planet and the like molten core, then you've got loads of space. And not only have you got loads of space, you've got loads of space in like 360 degrees. So you've actually got like a billion time larger world in a single planet than you could just by using the surface of the apple. And so then I got excited about, okay, well, then maybe there's these massive caverns big enough to hold cities, caverns big enough to hold entire oceans. Like, what goes on in this underground world? And I suppose I felt that there's not enough even unique in that opening gambit to be like, oh, okay, I definitely want to play this game rather than another fantasy game. Like, it doesn't grab me enough. It's not unique enough. So I wanted to start to drill down, boom, into these caverns and find out what was there and sort of discover what the unique richness was that was lying underneath the sort of initial premise. Um, and I guess I also, like, speaking personally for this project, like the reason that I'm going much deeper into the world building and fleshing this setting out is that I can, like, the publisher I'm working with is excited for me to blow this world out and is happy that the page count exists to make it happen, as opposed to some of the other the Osprey things that I've worked on where it wasn't requested, it wasn't required, it wasn't needed.
Now, one of the things I found that I've really enjoyed when we've sort of worked together is that personally, if I'm writing sort of a background, a bit of world building, my process tends to go a little bit along the lines of, here's a thing that I want to do that I think will be interesting. So I'm putting together some factions. I want a faction to do X because I think that'd be an interesting way for it to interact with the rules. Given the overall setting that we're in order for that faction to act like X, let's come up with an explanation, and the explanation is going to be Y. So, you know, I've got some a seaborne sort of ship combat game, you know, boarding game, and I want somebody who, you know, can jump around from location to location because I think that movement will be interesting. Okay, well, he's clearly some sort of swashbuckling piratey dude and he swings through the rigging, so these guys are all quite daring doey kind of guys, and there we go. That's my process of writing sort of background and world creation. Whereas you've often, you know, we've talked about the fact that you've put together like mini RPGs to guide you through the sort of the rules writing process sometimes. And when, you know, we first sort of started working together on Gaslands, you sort of came in with the sponsors, and you had sort of a story for them, who they were, who Slime was, what Slime's fans were like, what her teams were like. And then it's like, okay, well, that's interesting because it's quite fun to try and write some mechanics that explains why their team would act like that and why their team would act like that, given you've written the story. So it to me, it's quite interesting that you seem to come at the process a little bit sort of in the opposite way from me, that you sometimes like to do a bit of world building and go, okay, well, here's the world, what sort of explanations for these things happening within that world do we need to write mechanics and rules in order to explain? So is that sort of part of why you've come at Hobgoblin in that direction? And is, now that you are sort of getting deeper in, I think it's quite interesting that you seem to be getting deeper in the world building now, at a point where the mechanics and rules of Hobgoblin seem quite nailed down, relatively speaking. It feels to me like you're doing world building much more post rules creation than you did for Gaslands, for example.
Yeah, and in this case, actually, although I'm tempted to fiddle around the edges, like as I'm building out the pantheon of deities, abyssal gods that live in this realm, like I'm tempted to start messing around with the spells, which I might do, because, you know what, the spells haven't been they haven't been play tested to the nth degree, and I don't think there's a lot of terrible damage that can get done there. So I'm immediately wanting to fiddle around there, and there's a couple of elements that like are getting maybe rethemed and will probably get their names changed or stuff just to make them fit into the world. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like both in Gaslands and in A Billion Suns, I used the world building, the setting creation as a wedge to drive through a particularly sticky part of the mid game design process, where I've got a lot of stuff that seems to be working, but it's not quite gelling together. And then by creating a setting, I kind of find the connective musculature that kind of pulls everything together and makes it narratively complete and work in my head. Whereas in this case, it's like, well, I actually knew exactly what I wanted to do, which is I wanted a mass battle regiment game that could function really nicely in about 75 minutes. And I got that working. And then I was like, well, cool, that, as long as the setting has an explanation for why massive armies are constantly smashing into each other and everyone's dying, and that's apparently fine, we're just going to have another battle, maybe even in our campaign. Like, that's all the setting needs to do. It just needs to explain that weirdness. And so it's been fun coming to it after the fact and sort of like there are constraints as there are with any design practice. There's some constraints that I'm working within, which is sort of the inherited set of fantasy tropes must exist in this world, and that's kind of a weird it's a weird thing that I can't escape from, because it's not like I can go, well, do you know what, I don't want a bunch of like Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer style monsters in my thing. I'm just going to make up like everyone's elves and it's all about the elves or whatever. Like I can't do that because I'm building to a set of armies that people already have or that people are already selling, and a set of expectations that have to be met. So it's really like I could have just created a continent, spread the Beastmen over there and the Chaos Warriors over there. And
what I think is a certain amount that's going on is, from my perspective, is the thing with Gaslands is you're saying, okay, a bunch of people meet up in cars in a post-apocalyptic wasteland and then they engage in a race. That's a weird thing to do if you're living in a post-apocalyptic wasteland and you're desperately fighting for survival. Why have you decided to race against people? Why aren't you going off and trying to find food and scavenging for supplies? Well, that's because there's a massive TV corporation and they're basically going to pay you to race. And then that pays out an explanation as to how it is that there are things that get dumped on you that can like respawn your vehicles and shoot you ahead of the pack, because it's the overseers giving you things when the audience vote you up. So it explains audience votes, and it always requires. Whereas if you say, okay, there's some orcs and there's some humans and they're going to fight each other, pretty much once you said there are some orcs and some humans, the rest of that could just be ... What they're going to do? Well, they're going to fight each other. They're going to have a massive battle. Obviously, they're orcs and they're humans, and pretty much everything we know that defines orcs and humans is that they kick the hell out of each other when they get together. That's basically the shorthand for them. And so I guess there is a degree with Hobgoblin where it feels like that there was no necessity to explain the mechanics of what was going on. Once I'm at one side of a tabletop with an army and you're at the other side of a tabletop with an army and they're going to meet in the middle and kick the hell out of each other, I don't need any more explanation than that. Thank you very much. I'm very much aware of why they're there and what their purpose is and why they're going to kick each other to death. So, all right, personally, again, when I pick up, let's say, for example, a War Machine sort of textbook, one of these things that's yay thick, and I open it up and I see that there's like a solid 60 pages of background explanation of the interrelationships of all of these sort of different factions. And not just that, but this is a story that's been built up for, I'm well aware, 5 years or something before I've ever picked the system up. I die inside. I absolutely
really. Do you not read role-playing source books for fun? Do you find that categorically different?
Yeah, I think role-playing books are different because in my opinion the world there is the whole purpose of picking it up. What I want from a Malifaux rule book or a War Machine rule book is that I want to get interesting things onto the tabletop and then see them interact in an interesting way. I want to get the clockwork rolling as quickly as possible. I don't want you to tell me a story as to why the cogs are turning. I
think that's a very personal response to that sort of universe, because I think that like if you're coming at this which is like, hey, you know what I really want is I want a really unique, like tasty fantasy universe, and then I want a game in it, and I like toy soldiers the most. I would like to play toy soldiers in it, but like the most important thing for me is that like it comes fully realized and it's delicious and the artwork is great, and when I stick it down it does the things on the table that the story tells me it's going to do.
Yeah, no, the thing is, I totally agree. It is 100% a personal reaction there. That is, I totally agree. That is me personally. However, that said, I read a lot of sort of prototype rule sets just on a daily basis because people send me them. I give people feedback on their rule sets, and from I also hear other people's opinions and feedback on things, and how much background is too much background is a very movable feast. And there is definite opinions that, okay, this is too much. So for a board game, it's like if there are 5 pages of background at the start of a set of rules in a board game, people are going to come at you with like knives. And there's like there's a very good game, Sky Pirates, that I quite enjoy and have played quite a few times, and it's got literally like 6 A4 pages of background that are completely superfluous. I don't care in the
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you point to that, because, like, for example, the third edition of Warhammer Age of Sigmar, the most recent sort of textbook sized rulebook that they put out, like, clearly Games Workshop is trying to sell models. Clearly their fantasy IP is valuable to them. But that rulebook, okay, it starts with some images and a little bit of fluff text, but like, it's bang into the rules straight away, I think. And I'm pretty sure that all the fluff is in the back half of the book, which is a pretty standard way of approaching this, which is front load the game and then explain the setting, which actually, as I'm laying out Hobgoblin, is not what my initial instincts is, which is instead, in fact, to lay out something exciting and visceral that sets the tone, with a piece of artwork and a piece of like immediate writing that's very in the moment, and then to bring in some narrative to sort of explain what the world is like when you're looking at it from ground level. And then once you've sort of set the tone and given some people some sort of roots in, is then to sort of unpack the world and explain, here's what's going on and why, and why there's conflicts and so forth. And then having given you the tone and sort of where you are, having what's the word I'm looking for, like, you know, centered you, having oriented you, then I give you the army building rules first, like a role-playing game would, to be like, okay, so you've probably got a fantasy army, I've explained roughly what your guys are probably up to, like, how do you make your thing? And at that point, you've got your army, you're invested in some way in the world, you care about you care about the struggle and where your army fits in it, and then I give you the rules for resolving the battles at the last.
I suppose the tricky thing and part of the balancing act, and I think in reference to the way that I feel differently about it in a role-playing book, is that I could play a tabletop mass battle game with zero world building, like none whatsoever. I could still play it. It could still function. It's lovely to have the juicy squishiness of why I'm there, but I literally don't physically need it. Whereas in a role-playing game, it's literally, that's what I'm paying. I'm paying for a certain amount of world building.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's broadly true. I think that there's an old-fashioned way of dungeon crawling and sort of just wandering out of a village and down a hole of kobolds, which I think there is another way of doing that. But again, that's where war games and role-playing games divided in the evolutionary tree. So of course they're the same.
And I think it's interesting sort of mentioning Age of Sigmar there, because I think last time I was playing Age of Sigmar, I picked up one of the army books, and I think it was literally like 10 pages at the back of a sort of 70-page book with the actual physical rules that I needed to play the game. And I felt so ripped off by that, genuinely infuriated that it's like, why did I pay that much money for this pamphlet that you've not just tacked on an extra 70 pages to, you've then hardbound. You pay for a hardback book for 10 pages, you absolute monster. And I think that possibly is part of why there's a sort of a balancing act there, because it's like, look, I like having the sort of the fluff, and I want you to give me options about how much fluff I need to sort of engage with to enjoy the game. But fundamentally, what I'm paying you for is to write me some rules. I'm paying for the rules set. I'm not really paying for the fluff, in my opinion. And the fluff is nice, but it's not ultimately what I can't make up. I can make the fluff up myself. I don't think if you gave me a set of rules with no fluff, I could fill the fluff in. If you gave me a set of fluff with no rules, I can't necessarily go, all right, okay, I'll figure the rules out. It's no problem. I'll literally make them up on the fly at the tabletop.
Let me just hold you there for a second. All right, so you said that you paid the designer, the writer, money for the rules, not necessarily for the setting. I guess I would put it to you that, like, what you're really paying for is a sort of playground. It's a sandbox, and that sandbox might be filled with more construction equipment, or it might be filled with more toys. Like, what matters is that the whole thing that you get given in and of itself, in its complete form, is lovely to interact with. It's lovely to read. It's lovely to pick up and play. And in some cases, I suppose, like, you know, you'll, you know, I'll grab a game and I'll want to grab a player and be like, the thing that's exciting about this game is X, and sometimes that's the intricate rules mechanic or the unique thing, but sometimes it's just like, well, here's a world that would be really cool to mess about in. And so I do think it's perfectly reasonable for it to be an intrinsic part of the attraction of the game. But I think that probably it isn't more, it's not more often than it is the central reason.
Do you think there's difference between, let's say, world building and fluff? And by what I mean by that is, I feel like the fluff is sort of like, okay, you need to know how this thing works, like what the best tactics to approach this army with is, or how they're meant to act, or how they're meant to behave on the tabletop. I'll give you some fluff to sort of guide you through that. World building is maybe, here's a layered and delicious place that you want to interact with and you want to visit, and that's a sort of pulling you in, and now here's a game we can play within that brilliant and exciting world.
Yeah, that's interesting that you sort of pull those two things apart. I suppose in my head they were just like more or less impactful or successful versions of each other, or maybe like the story, the narrative, the setting is built of these little atoms of like, well, you know, this religious order is a bit like this, and these maces are magical, and you know, these little facts over time add up into world building. But pointing in the other direction, they also do something, as you suggest, like really useful, which is, oh, well, I know that this mace is probably good against undead because it's an enchanted mace, and so like that little piece of setting detail then allows me to remember a piece of game mechanic or intuit a piece of strategical stuff. So I think you want lots of little bits of descriptive fluff or like explanatory fiction to help you navigate the components of the game. And if they do add up to a rich and coherent world, then that's the goal, right? Like that's sort of like, in a weird way, and actually I started sort of researching this to a degree in before I started the Hobgoblin fluff. Like to a degree, that's sort of what flavor text in Magic the Gathering cards do. Like they're part of an entire package, which is, and I listened to literally one of the designers of this going through this, but like there's the name of the card, there's the artwork, there's the rules, and then there's optionally a piece of flavor text, and all of those things have to come together to like instantly convey a convincing sense of what the card is and how it fits in the world and why it fits in your deck and what the usage of it is.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
So I think I was just going to give a sort of personal little sort of story of how one, you know, Malifaux, my journey through this with Malifaux to a degree. So first edition Malifaux, I've always been a Resurrectionist player in Malifaux, and Seamus in first edition had a sort of a way of playing that he was basically like the Dark Knight Joker. The more chaos that is going on the tabletop, the more likely you are to win. And the way that it works rules-wise in that particular edition of the game was quite subtle. It wasn't instantly obvious through like looking at his rule set that the more sort of insanity that was going on, the better off you'd be doing. But it was all there in his fluff. It was all there in his storyline. Everything he did, he just basically always turned up, set a bomb off, and then just danced through the chaos that ensued, sort of getting by. And it's there sort of, as I say, quite subtly within his rules, within his powers and abilities. And realizing that if you played him the way that the background said he should be played, you got really good at playing him in that first edition Malifaux. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was brilliant. That made me so happy, and it really got me into playing that. And then in my opinion, with each following edition of Malifaux, there's been more and more world building, more and more sort of, oh, there's another sort of 50 pages about Molly Squid Pidge's relationship with Sonia Creed or whatever it happens to be, and less of this sort of, this is telling you the way that they will play on the tabletop and guiding you through some quite subtle interactions we've done. And it's much more, well, you know what that person does, they blow stuff up, so just min-max their blowing stuff up and you'll be absolutely fine. And that game lost me as it put in more world building, and for me gave less respect to the fluff. And that's literally my personal sort of relationship and journey through that, what I felt like that changeover was from the very first edition of Malifaux, where there's very little world, and sort of very mechanics orientated, and a beautiful, I always thought, relationship between the fluff and the mechanics. And I feel that that just died to a point where what we've got is a really competitive, crunchy, hardcore game that has like a novel stapled on the top of it. You like the novel, right? And you like the game, right? So brilliant, enjoy.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, because it sort of speaks to like the efficiency, the utility of having that narrative, having that setting in the context of the form, which is a tabletop game. And I guess, like, reflecting on my most recent obsession at the moment is Elden Ring on the PlayStation. And like every sort of moment, every moment of story, every like thing that I am told, every piece of like inconsequential stuff that comes out, like I'm analyzing it for more clues, because it's quite an opaque setting and it doesn't just explain itself. You have to, and so in that way, like moving through the game, understanding the game, being better at the game is sort of similarly like that setting efficiency, if you like, or like the richness of the setting in that first edition Malifaux is that it's intrinsically linked to the form itself. It's not stapled on the top, as you say. Yeah, but I guess I'd still return to, like, there's no reason for enormous army books to have all this sort of background setting information for Warhammer 40,000, for example. But there is a lot of genuine pleasure from gamers, including me, in like understanding and learning more about digging down into this universe. Because then when I do put things on the table, yes, they probably feel like minor betrayals if they don't do the thing that they did in the story, or that you've been told that they do. And there's definitely, it's critical that they do that. But at the same time, like, the story can bring meaning to the action on the table in a way that I think is quite satisfying. It's almost harder to do that bigger thing in that second thing in a character-driven, tight narrative game like Malifaux. Like the problem with Malifaux's tight character focus was that, like, everyone's playing Molly Squidge-Piddle. Like, why is there so much happening to this woman when she clearly only does these like 6 things? Because we can see them, they're written down in the story. Whereas, like, what are these Chaos Warriors up to? Well, they're up to a completely different thing to these Chaos Warriors, and I already told you about these other Chaos Warriors that were doing something completely different. And like, there's just a lot more latitude for you to say, all right, well, cool Chaos Warrior stuff that has happened in the setting, I'm going to bring a cocktail of that into my game table, and that will enrich the experience. And I suppose my hope with the Hobgoblin thing is that the setting then adds a new layer of meaning, a fresh layer of meaning onto the battles and onto the armies, and very, very specifically inspires you to do new things, like to build a new kind of terrain, to wants to build a board that, and this is like, this I find is what Warhammer 40,000 does so phenomenally well with its setting information. Is it's very rare that I will put down a Warhammer 40,000 book, be it an army book or one of the campaign books for like Adeptus Titanicus, and not immediately want to build a new gaming table to like represent one of the cool biomes or scenario or sort of planets that they've put in the setting. So and Hobgoblin itself is very much about breathing fresh life into armies that might have got stale. And so I think doing the same thing by providing a sort of atypical slanted fantasy setting and saying, well, because these are elves, but they're underground, that breathes new meaning into this army. It gives you new ways to fight, new things to fight over, new situations that you can imagine. Like now there's rocks falling from the thing, and now there's ways of escaping through tunnels and so forth. And it can be mechanically represented, but at its heart, my hope is just that it sort of makes you excited to pick up an old army or build a new one and be like, oh, cool, I've never thought about doing like subterranean lava orcs. Let's do those.
Okie dokie. Well, I think we're going to wrap up this part of this conversation at this point. If you've watched the video to this point, I assume you enjoy what we're doing. Please do like and subscribe. If you've got a favorite setting, a favorite piece of background, world building, army creation story, whatever you want to call it, please let us know in the comments section. Drop us a little line about your absolute favorite fantasy or other world, and yeah, we'll hopefully pick up on this maybe at a later point. For now, look us up on social media, but I think we're going to say goodbye from this episode of Rule of Carnage.
Bye bye, you bunch of lava elves.